My name is David Kramer. I'm the director of the library here at the Jewish Theological Seminary. It has been our privilege over the course of the last few years to sponsor these faculty book talks. We have a very prolific faculty, and they have been kind enough to speak about their recently published books as part of this series, and it enables us to bring the new and very important work that's happening here at JTS to you. And you all know why you're here, so I'm not going to say all that much about it. Eitan Fishbane joined our faculty here 3 years plus ago. This is your fourth year, you said, right? He teaches in the Department of Jewish Philosophy, Jewish Thought, teaches courses in mysticism, Chassidut, and the like. And from the description, you know, in general terms, the subject of the book. I do want to say that I've taken the occasion of these book talks personally to read all of the books that are being spoken about. And so I just recently, Thanksgiving and flying here and there provides wonderful opportunities to sit down and read. You've got a lot of hours waiting in airports, and on planes, I might add. So I had an occasion to read this. I was actually a little bit afraid in the midst of reading this on the plane that if I took it too seriously, it might mess up the plane's, like radar control system, so because I was reading about all kinds of mystical speculation and things like that. I confess that I did not myself personally heed the dictum which bids us to wait till after we're 40 to study Jewish mysticism. I began my study of it before 40, but I have waited till after 40, that was more than a couple of years ago, to actually take some of the practices more seriously. And I must say that the book, amongst its many, many qualities, really provides access to practices of mystical concentration, speculation, in ways that will help you, for example, understand the Shema as you have never understood it before. I also have to say that one of the reasons that I love reading these books is it enables me to add to my syllabi. In other words, my students in the next semester always have the opportunity to see some of our most recent faculty scholarship. So there's a wonderful section here on the way the body and the soul torment one another, which will be relevant to a course that I'm teaching on the body and sexuality in Judaism next term. So this will be on Blackboard, right? I will encourage the students to buy it, though. I won't detain us any longer. You will enjoy the presentation, and I hope that you will have occasion to read the book as well, to read the book because you will find it, if not mystical, at least enlightening. So, Professor Eitan Fishbane.
Wonderful. Well, it's a really great pleasure, and it's especially wonderful to be a part of this series, which I think is a really wonderful innovation, a really wonderful aspect of the intellectual culture here at JTS, and to be able to learn from and share with my colleagues and students and members of the community. This book really reflects a good number of years of thinking about the question of kavanah, of intention in Jewish mysticism, and I was drawn to the writings of Yitzchak de Akko, of Isaac of Akko, primarily for the way in which he talks about and represents the nature of religious experience, the way he talks about mystical experience. And this is actually a relatively rare phenomenon in the history of Jewish mysticism. In contrast to mystical thinkers and authors of other religious traditions, it's long been observed that the Jewish mystics were very reluctant to speak in the first person confessional voice about their experiences. This was a famous observation that was made by Gershom Scholem, one of the great scholars of Jewish mysticism, of Judaism of the 20th century, who observed that unlike Christian mystics, unlike mystics of other religious faiths as well, the Jewish mystics were far more inclined to speak about the nature of religious experience through, let's say, the paradigms of great figures of the Torah, or to speak about it at the most in prescriptive terms, right, instructional terms. This is how you should fulfill this religious practice. And certainly in exegetical, interpretive terms, right, as is at the heart of Jewish creativity throughout the ages, the Jewish mystical creativity emerged through exegesis, through interpretation of the Torah, through a kind of symbolic interpretation of the Torah, in an effort to reveal what they believed to be contained within it as insights and revelations of the inner divine mysteries, of the inner divine life. But precious few Jewish mystics spoke about their own experiences, despite the fact that we have every reason to assume that, like all human beings, they had experiences, right? But the question of recovering that first-person voice, that autobiographical voice, is exciting and rare. And we have one of the true rarities of medieval Jewish manuscripts, of medieval Jewish literature, medieval Jewish mystical literature, is the writing of Yitzchak ben Shmuel de Min Akko, of Isaac ben Samuel of Akko, who was a Kabbalist, a Mikubal, who lived at the turn of the 14th century, began his life in the port city of Akko, which was under Crusader control at that time, and then after a major battle and the fall of the Crusader domination of the city of Akko, he and many other Jewish refugees fled, and this is in 1291, fled the city. And he eventually made his way to different parts of Jewish Europe at the time, eventually finding his way to Sfarad, eventually finding his way to what we would now call Spain. And one of the fascinating features of Isaac of Akko was his mobility, was his wandering status, right? So as a mystic, as a religious seeker, who wandered from one place to the next in the Jewish world, he picked up different types of traditions, different types of Kabbalistic traditions that were current at the time in different geographical locations. And so we have a kind of eclecticism, which is one of the things that I talk about in the book, a kind of ingathering of different types of traditions that Isaac of Akko reports having learned along his way. He makes his way to the city of Barcelona and hears teachings directly from the mouth of the Rashba, of Shlomo ibn Adret, right, one of the great halachic thinkers of the medieval period, the disciple of the Ramban, of Moses Nachmanides, and a variety of other thinkers. And he eventually makes his way to Castile, where he seeks out the authorship of the Zohar, the mystery of how this supposed ancient midrash of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the ancient Tana, came to emerge in medieval times where it had not been known before. So one of the fascinating features of Isaac of Akko, and one of the keys to understanding his creativity, is the way in which he met different people of his time and combined and bridged different types of traditions. This actually, I believe, accounts for the way in which he merges a type of meditative, contemplative Kabbalah with the Kabbalah of the Sfirot, the Kabbalah of the inner divine emanations, the 10 divine emanations that was so dominant in medieval Sfarad. Despite the fact that we know, and it has been argued, that the Kabbalists who talked about the Sfirot in a very active way also were representing their spiritual experience, their religious experience in a variety of ways. Oftentimes, or very rarely, do we see any glimpses of that actual experience I mentioned before. But in the so-called East, right, in the northern land of Israel, where there was a lot of influence of Sufi mystics and other types of spiritual trends, the Kabbalah, the mysticism of that location was much more overtly meditative, much more overtly contemplative, much more overt in its reflection on the nature of religious experience and the nature of mystical experience and the path to its attainment. So one of the exciting features of Yitzchak de Yaakov, Isaac of Akko, is the way in which he bridges those different elements of those different Kabbalistic traditions of the times. And what emerges in Isaac of Akko's work is a fascinating representation of contemplative mysticism, of meditative practice, of intention for prayer, of kavanah for the tefillah, that is both highly prescriptive in the sense and instructive in the sense that it seeks to set out a guided practice, really, for the reader in how to contemplate God through engagement with the liturgy. I'll read an example in a moment. How the experience of performing the liturgy, of saying the liturgy, is directly linked to a practice of interior contemplative intention. So one of the things that I argue in the book is that we can notice two types of mystical practice, of religious practice. One is the external, which is the publicly observable religious practice, right? The things that we can see someone doing. And the other is the internal, which correlates to the intentionality or the state of mind or the kavanah of the person. And for the Kabbalists, intention itself, the mode of thought, was understood to be a kind of religious performance, a kind of performance of ritual behavior. We can see interesting antecedents of this, let's say, in Bachya ibn Pakuda's Chovot HaLevavot, right? So the notion of how you have obligations or mitzvot of the heart, which correlate to the mind and of certain types of belief. But that intentionality, or the way in which the mind was to be conducted in the performance of ritual and in the performance specifically of prayer, was understood to be a type of highly significant religious practice, of contemplative practice, that the mystics believed had a powerful cosmic effect on God and on the whole universe. That how one thought about God, how one oriented one's mind and focus and concentration in the act of prayer in particular, and other mitzvot in general, actually had the power to stimulate and draw down the divine emanation, the divine energies through the cosmos to maintain the harmony of divinity. That insight or that idea of theurgy is, of course, not new. That's a major piece of medieval Kabbalah. But the emphasis on how intentionality and the inner focus becomes a practice that is designed to facilitate that maintenance of the cosmos is quite striking. So in Isaac of Akko's writing, and this is especially so in his later writing, his Otsar Chaim, Treasure House of Life, which was his slightly later work, we see a fascinating revelation of the first-person voice of mystical literature. We see Isaac of Akko talking about his own experiences, and more specifically, his experiences of engaging with the world around him in such a way that it would stimulate his mind and imagination to new mystical heights, to new penetration of the mysteries of divinity that he otherwise had not yet grasped. So one of the striking features of his writing is the way in which he talks about those moments and the various ways in which those moments have a stimulating effect upon the mystical imagination. One of the ways in which he talks about this, and this is something I talk about at some length in the book, is related to sleep. and waking from sleep, or what he calls nim velo nim, right, which is a Talmudic phrase, right, meaning asleep but not asleep, or semi-conscious, half awake, which ultimately, and here he's influenced by certain other thinkers as well, ultimately is understood to be, right, that liminal place between consciousness, that place of in-betweenness in the mind, where we're neither here nor there, is the moment of the greatest contemplative mystical insight. That's the moment, he says, when the deepest understanding of the divine infinity, of the mysteries of God, can be fathomed. So he speaks about this process, and he says, "Hakitzoti mishnati v'ra'iti sod." I arose from my sleep, I awakened from my sleep, and I suddenly saw the secret, or the chapter in here, it's called Seeing the Secret. That's a big part of what that chapter is about. But he often will say, I woke from my sleep, but still benim vilonim. When I was asleep but not quite asleep, that's when I truly understood the sod. That's when I truly understood the secret meaning of God. Another major feature another major way in which Isaac of Akko talks about that stimulation of mystical consciousness is the encounter with the natural world. He reports in the first-person voice, in a confessional voice, experiences of encountering phenomena of the natural world in such a way that they stimulate his mystical imaginings, such that he sees the world around him as a portal, as a doorway, as a stimulus to deep understandings of divinity. For the Kabbalists, not just for Isaac of Akko, for the Kabbalists, it was believed that everything in this world is a reflection of an upper paradigm, of an upper mystery of God. Everything as the Zohar says, Alma tata'a kegavna de alma de la'ela. The world below exists on the model of the world on high. So this world is truly a microcosm, is truly a reflection of what is above, but in a way that we can fathom it as human beings. But Isaac of Akko talks about that process. He talks about encountering a mountain, and I'll mention that I'll read the passage about this mountain in a moment. And this mountain leads him to an insight about the nature of the Shekhinah, about the nature of the Sfirot. Let me make sure I open to the right page here. So I'll read a little bit here of my analysis leading up to this fascinating text. And this is on page 117. In addition to the stimulative power associated with waking from sleep and ritual practice, Isaac of Akko frequently frames new interpretive insight as the product of an encounter with the natural world, thereby viewing the created realm as alive with symbolic traces of the divine, as filled with hidden markers of the truths of metaphysical reality. The sight of the physical eyes, engaged with the phenomena of the natural world, reads earthly reality as a symbolic text, an interpretive cipher for the deep structures of the divine. And here is the passage where he talks about this moment of contemplating the natural world and what it leads him to. I was contemplating, or gazing at, a tall mountain, and I saw a secret in the color blue. Ra'iti sod b'tzeva hatchelet. The secret is that you should know the word techelet, literally blue, is the language of completion and perfection. Lashon tachlit v'shlemut. So already, just to embed the analysis, right? He sees the tchelet of the mountain And that leads him to an association ultimately about the Shekhinah, who is Tachlit. She is the completion of the Sfirot, and she is also the Tchelet, the blue, that holds the Yud within her. She holds the 10 Sfirot all within her, because the only difference between Tachlit and Tchelet is the Yud. So the Yud, which represents the 10, is contained within the Tchelet that is the Shekhinah. She is blue also because that is the color of the sea, of the ocean. And she is the Yama Rabba. She is the great sea, right? Because all the rivers flow to the sea. All the rivers flow into the great ocean that is Shekhinah. All this upper Sfirot flow into the Shekhinah. And Tchelet is also the language of yearning. As it is written, I long in Psalm 84, I long, I yearn for the courts of God. That is to say, my soul yearns for the Sphira called Tachlit, which includes all the other colors within it. Shekol hagvanim nichlalim bo. So she is the color that includes all colors. She is the water that includes all waters. She is the Sphira that contains all of the divine emanations and transmits those energies to the lower world. And therefore, and here's another reflection on ritual practice, the 8th thread of the tzitzit that binds together and includes or embraces the 7 other white threads hints at the Sphira Chokhmah, for she is the divine wisdom that includes or embraces the 7 branches of the pure candelabrum, HaMenorah HaTorah. And he goes on to list the different Sphirot. So ultimately, both the tzitzit and the mountain become, and the colors of the mountain become symbolic representations, symbolic stimuli for the mystical imagination. Since Dr. Kramer mentioned the practice of the Shema, I don't want to disappoint you, so I'm going to find that one here. Ah, 200. That's on page 200. So this is in the process of reciting the Shema. It says, when he utters the divine name, Yud He Vav He, he should elevate the thought of his mind from the Sphira Atara, which is Shekhinah, means crown, that is atop his head. In other words, Shekhinah is resting on his head as a kind of crown, but it's the divine self resting on the head of the mystic. Through Tiferet, which is the Sphira above, which is the Sphira a few above Atara, but Tiferet is linked to Shekhinah, and the other Sphirot until he arrives at the first without beginning, the last without end, which is Ein Sof, which is the infinite. And ultimately, for Isaac of Akko, one of the great aspirations of the contemplative life, and the ultimate goal, is to actually reach the domain of infinity, which is actually quite striking and runs to some extent contrary to what what we normally think about in terms of Kabbalistic thought. And I think that's one of the chidushim of the book, right? Is that he actually talks about the meditative attempt and the belief that the mind can attain this location called Ein Sof, called the infinite. And that is the ultimate goal of meditative practice. That's the ultimate aim from which everything else flows. So let's pay attention to the practice. When he utters, and here this is the prescriptive voice, right? And other times he's talking about in the autobiographical voice. Here he's saying, when you do this, or when he does this, right? When he utters the name of God, that's when the thought of his mind, or the kavanah, the intention, should rise up to that high place. So it's an actual prescription for what one's mind should be doing contemplatively in this amazing ascent to the heights while one is performing the standard liturgy of the ritual practice. The first without beginning, the last without end. Ein Sof, blessed is the name of the glory of his kingdom forever and ever, right? Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Olam Va'ed. So that's, of course, linked to the Shema practice here, right? And he should not separate the thought of his mind from Ein Sof quickly. For the mind's act of standing in Ein Sof is a mode of devotion more proper than all other modes of devotion. And when he says Eloheinu, right, we're still in the Shema, going to be a long recitation of the Shema, right? When he says Eloheinu, he should draw forth the thought of his mind from her, Ein Sof, it's just the gendered nature of the language, down to Atara, as Shechina, so you're going up, and then you're going down, and then down to his own head, Ve'ad Rosh Atzmo. Right, so you're actually drawing the energies of infinity all the way down through the Sefirot, and then actually onto the person in prayer themselves receives that efflux of divine life. When he says Yud He Vav He again, right, we're still in the Shema, he should elevate the thought of his mind a second time from his head, from his head and Atara, because Atara Shechina is resting on his head, up to the first without beginning, the last without end, up to Ein Sof. So it's this traveling process, which, by the way, is the Kabbalistic equivalent of the late antique version of Jewish mysticism, of Merkava mysticism, chariot mysticism, which spoke about an ascent to the divine world, right? And which some believed actually was a physical ascent. There were those who argued both ways. Here, it's literally a contemplative ascent. Well, there's some who said it was a contemplative ascent in Merkava times too. And now it's the last word of the Shema. And when he says Echad, one, he should again draw forth the thought of his mind from Ein Sof down to Atara, while uttering the chet of the word Echad, he should engage in this drawing forth. And while uttering the Daled of Echad, he should give an extra third of a measure to elevate the thought of his mind from Atara, who dwells in his head, all the way up to Ein Sof. While the thought of his mind is ascending through the Kava Emtsa'i, through that middle line of the Sfirot, and while he is lengthening the Dalet of Echad, the tip of his tongue cleaves to his teeth, the D sound. For the number of his teeth is 32. I checked this with my dentist. Like the number of the 32 paths of supernal wisdom, or the Lamed Bet Nitivot Pliot Chochma of Sefer Yetzirah. So here we have a fascinating practice, right, of an actual recitation of the Shema and of the Echad that is this contemplative journey that is linked to the enunciative process, to the process of enunciating the word Echad. You can imagine a very drawn-out, meditative recitation of the Shema, but one that is part of this contemplative pilgrimage, this ascent to the divine sacred center that is God's own self, within God's own self, the pathways that lead up into that inner temple of God and that draw down the divine energies as an attempt to bring down that divine sustenance into the whole of the cosmos. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a taste of what this kind of practice is. And Isaac of Akko, really the study of techniques of Jewish mysticism is still developing, as is reflection or analysis of this self-reflection, right? The self-reflective voice. What does it mean, as theorists of autobiography and in the study of literature have talked about? What does it mean to speak in a self-conscious voice? What does it mean to scrutinize one's own life? To write the life of oneself? And what does it mean to speak in this fragmented voice about the nature of meditative technique, of religious practice that constructs a powerful conception of the nature of intention and the structure of the mind? Isaac of Akko went on to have a very significant impact upon later Kabbalah, despite the fact that he was didn't achieve, let's say, the fame of some of the other of certain other Kabbalists. Especially his early work, Me'irat Einayim, the illumination of the eyes, was copied many times, so we know that it was read. The Otzar Chaim, the text that most preserves his autobiographical voice, only survives in one complete manuscript in the Moscow Ginsburg collection, and then some other fragments. So that may have been a little less read, or, well, we don't know. Otzar Chaim has not been printed. There was a critical edition done of Me'irat Einayim, but not of Otzar Chaim. So I guess in the book, by the way, you'll see Stanford gave me permission to transcribe all of my Hebrew sources in there. So I have the Hebrew and the English in there. So there are a lot of sources here which are transcribed from Otzar Chaim, which can't be found unless you're going to look up the Moscow manuscript, except in this book. So let me open it up to some questions. Mr. Schwartz.
Fantastic presentation. Thank you very much, Professor. In terms of your description of Isaac of Akko's meditative practice, which allows him to ascend up the spherotic tree all the way up to the infinite, I was wondering if you could compare that to someone like Joseph Chikatile's work in Sha'arei Ora, which in a sense is constructed very similarly, starting with the 10th sphera of Shekhinah and then going all the way up to the first. And in a sense, could be seen as a similarly structured work in terms of practice.
Yes, beautiful. You're absolutely right. And actually, the beginning of Sha'arei Ora, which was, for those of you who don't know, a great classic of medieval Jewish mysticism from the period of the Zohar, late 13th century Castile, a very systematic and clear primer of the Sfirot, but very related to prayer, as you're intuiting, or as you know, right? And the beginning of that, which is a kind of entry inward, begins with reflection on the phrase Adonai sfatai tiftach ufi yagid tilatecha, which there's another interesting text that I discuss in here, which talks about that as a contemplative practice, an opening up of the way. Adonai sfatai tiftach, open. Adonai meaning Shekhinah. Aleph Daled Nun Yud, because that's the actual name that's used in the original verse. Open the way, Sfatai Tiftach, open the edges, open the borders, so that I may ascend upward into the divine reaches, up to Bina, and then draw down the energies. Ufi Yagid Tilatecha, and that my mouth, in what I say, draw it down in the sense of Yagid, like Nagad, as we find in Daniel, right, in the sense of drawing down this flow called Tilatecha. So I think that what Yosef Chikatile in Sha'arei Ora is that's very much reflecting a kind of contemplative practice. You're absolutely right, and it's a kind of entryway that's related to Kavanah of Tefillah. Very nice. Mel. Professor Skull.
A question directly from Jerusalem. From my very Haredi son, who sits.
I thought you were going to say Amos Goldreich.
Not quite. Who sits in Jerusalem and studies Torah and makes children. He asked me to ask you the following question. It is well known that Isaac of Akko was actively involved in the authentication process of the Zohar. Could you comment briefly what his conclusions were? That's a question for my son, not for you.
Very nice, very nice. And as a matter of fact, I actually do discuss it in here. It's a very important question because I mentioned this a little bit briefly. Isaac of Akko achieved his first fame through the record that he sought out Moshe de Leon, what Sholem thought was the lone gunman of Zohar authorship. But it turns out to be more composite than that. But he sought out Moshe de Leon, who was the Kabbalist of late 13th century Castile, who said, I have found the ancient midrash of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, lo and behold, right? And the famous story regarding the Zohar. And the story goes, as it was preserved in Zakuto Sefer Yuchasin, that Isaac of Akko had heard the great lore, had heard the great story of this new manuscript, or this new midrash of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the ancient Tana, who wrote a Kabbalistic treatise. How did you find it? Where did you find it? And he goes and he seeks him out, and first he meets him in one place, and he says, oh, come, I'll meet you in the next town, just a few donkey drives over, right? And by the time he gets there, Moshe de Leon has died. And he winds up supposedly talking to de Leon's widow. It's all hearsay, as they say. And she reports to him, right, that no, he wrote it all himself. Right, so the question is was Isaac, if that's true, that whole story, was Isaac of Akko convinced? Right, so that's the question, right? And what I found actually in a series of passages in Otzar Chaim as evidence for this, it's clear to me that in his later stage, Isaac of Akko did believe that the Zohar was authored by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, in terms of the way he ascribes the authorship of passages, and speaks about when he copies down a tradition from the Zohar, he very clearly is approving the idea that this is the work of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So he says that as Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says and said, and he quotes passage from the Zohar and so forth. So it was clear that he either believed it or was in cahoots. But he never comes out and says, it was really that De Leon character.
Otzar Chaim comes after.
Otzar Chaim comes afterwards. It's likely that it was, in all probability, it was after 1305 or 1310. This relates in part to references to the well, we know that Me'irat Einayim had to have been authored before 1305 because of references to the Rashba as living at the time, as opposed to Rav Shlomo Ibn Adret, without the appendage of Zichrono Livracha. But it's been speculated. We don't know for sure, but it's been speculated that Otzar Chaim was written anywhere from 1307 or 8 through 1333 or something. It's likely that Isaac of Akko first he travels through Europe and then eventually makes his way down to North Africa again. But it's clear that Me'irat Einayim is his earlier phase. Me'irat Einayim, the illumination of the eyes, is a meta-commentary on the Ramban's commentary on the Torah. So it's a Be'ur Sodot, it's part of the genre Be'ur Sodot HaRamban, or the clarification of the expansion on the secrets of the Ramban, that he may have heard from, in part, in the school of the Rashba. He reports having heard Kabbalistic traditions from both the Rashba and the Ritba in Barcelona. Please.
As a visual person and a maker of things, I'm kind of fascinated by all these associations with natural phenomena and the great sea and the color, including all colors. So I'm really interested in this idea of the superlit and association of colors. So I'm curious, in your studies, what you've come across with this specifics of the color.
There's a lot to that effect, and it's a very fascinating piece of the tradition. The Zohar itself, right, late 13th century, at least in terms of when it was finished, is replete with color imagery, and constantly is referring to the Sfirot through their symbolic color reference. So So one color refers to the force of severity or judgment, and one color refers to purity or compassion or unbounded love, and another color refers to the balance of them, and another color refers to masculinity, and another to femininity, and so on and so forth. And there are actually manuscripts from the medieval times that portrait those colors. In one case, a manuscript that I looked at with Moshe Idel in Jerusalem, it portraits the colors, and it doesn't actually color them in, but it indicates the colors in concentric circles, which is part of the contemplative practice. But it's later in the 16th century, in the writings of Moshe Cordovero, who was one of the great kind of the Thomas Aquinas of Kabbalistic discourse of 16th century, before Isaac Luria in Tzfat, refers a great deal to this, especially in his Or Ne'erav, which and there's actually I think there's a translation and edition of that which was done, and but he specifically refers to this question of how we understand the nature of the Sfirot as multiple and yet as a unified singularity. And so speaks about it as that just as, he says, imagine it as sunlight flowing through a stained glass window. And you experience that light as many different colors from looking at the stained glass window, but really it's that one flow of light. And I had a further revelation about this when reading the Magic School Bus series to my 6-year-old daughter, that essentially the notion of white light, right, as containing this full spectrum. You'd say, well, you should have learned that in science class, right? The notion of white light as containing the full spectrum of colors is deeply resonant with this, right? In the sense that for the Kabbalist, the whole spectrum of colors are hidden within the oneness of light, just as that oneness is hidden within the diversity. So the manifold nature of color in the world is essentially a reflection of the way in which diversity is an outer veil for complete unity. The deep within it is all one, the mystics would say, where all colors merge and combine. So go forth and paint it. Please.
Yeah, if it is the case that at the most real level everything is an undifferentiated unity, where does that leave the status of commandments, where God appears to be presupposing a sharp distinction between creator and creation?
This is the big dilemma, right? The mystic on the one hand wants to argue that all is one, that all is a reflection of the deep oneness of things. And yet the inescapable experience of the mystic as a human being is that the world is full of separateness, is full of division, is full of the many, right? So in many ways, the great question of mysticism is, what is the relationship between the many and the one? What is the relationship between this manifold nature of reality as we experience it and the deep oneness of things? So ultimately, maybe if you pushed them on it, the Kabbalists would say, well, we can only achieve that fullest, that greatest realization of unity in a redeemed state, right? But for the Kabbalist, the life of the mitzvot, right, as exemplified in the ritual practice of prayer, but in all the mitzvot, are understood to be deeply powerful instruments of influence in the divine world and of the cosmos. So halakha and the mitzvot are at the heart of the way the Kabbalistic enterprise functions. That it's essentially deeply bound up in what we would call ta'amei ha-mitzvot, right? The reasons for the commandments. For them, the reasons for the commandments are both a kind of way of connecting to God and of the human ability and the human imperative to facilitate and orchestrate the very balance and nature of the divine flow and the divine life force. Sam?
Just as a footnote to that, the effort of Vidui at Yom Kippur can also be seen as an effort towards at-one-ment.
Very nice. Yeah, there's a kind of the yearning of the mystic, for the most part anyway, is this yearning for a return to the fullness of God, a yearning for kind of reabsorption. That's actually I have a whole chapter in the book on mystical union, indebted to, of course, to other scholars like Moshe Idel. In which the yearning of the spiritual life is essentially a kind of reabsorption in the great river of divinity. That when our physical blinders are taken off, the mystic says, we will be able to see reality as it truly is, as the complete undifferentiated, sparkling, radiant river of life that is divinity. Should we take another question? Please.
So you described this experience as Isaac Obako and others as going from, I understood it, from the body up to beyond the crown and somewhere into the oneness. I would like to ask you, I was in touch a little bit with other traditions like Taoism, and there is a difference where the experience is rooted in the body, like the way for achieving oneness is rooted in the body. So I'm wondering if there is something in that nature in Jewish mysticism at all.
Well, on the one hand, and this is, the question was, let's say in relationship to other traditions like Taoism, to what extent is the body a central vehicle for the yearning for and reaching of the divine, right? And so I would say there are two sides to this, right? On the one hand, the Kabbalists are inheritors of, let's say, the Neoplatonic and the Platonic tradition of a kind of radical tension between physicality and spirituality, of the body and the soul. Right, the soul that doesn't want to enter into the body and that is imprisoned in the body, as we see in Plato, right, and that essentially reincarnates, and that ultimately the highest yearning is to reach beyond physicality, to subdue those wild passions, to be able to achieve a kind of spiritual enlightenment. But on the other hand, the Kabbalist argues that just as everything in the natural world is a microcosm of that which is above, and therefore through this world we come to the upper world, so too with regard to the body, right? As it says in Job, right? Mi besari echazeh Eloha, from my flesh I will see God. So the introspection, the reflection on the symbolism of the body, from its tenfold nature, in the sense of the hands and the feet, to all of its various dimensions and forms, becomes symbolic reference for the mystic as a path to God, as a way to understand that from the physical I will come to the metaphysical. Thank you.
Eitan, thank you very much. I want to thank all of you for coming.